My name is Ma, and until I turned 33, the most exciting event in my life was that the accounting firm I worked for switched from a PC to a Mac. It's certainly not exactly exciting, is it? But then everything changed at a party held in honor of my friend's birthday. I remember that evening not with bright lights or loud music, but with meeting him, with Peter. I stood in the corner of the cramped living room, clutching a glass of soda in my hand, feeling uncomfortable in a too-tight dress. The music was blaring so loudly that it seemed as if the words were just disappearing into the bass, blurring the conversations around. No one was paying attention to me, and I honestly tried to hide my desire to be somewhere else. But then, among the crowd, he appeared. Peter. Tall, taller than everyone else, with a confidence that immediately riveted his gaze on me. He came up to me as if he had long ago decided that this evening would be ours. He had the gait of a man who knew his worth. "Hey, you're Ahmad, aren't you?" he asked, his voice sounding clear despite the volume of the music. I nodded, not knowing what to say, and tried to look calm, even though my heart was already starting to beat faster. "Yeah, and you?" I managed, trying not to show my excitement. He smiled, leaning slightly towards me. "Peter. I see you all around. May I join you?" Without waiting for my answer, he just stood next to me, as if everything was self-evident. My "not at all," uttered against the background of a roaring pop song, sounded almost unintelligible. But it didn't seem to bother him. "So, Ma, what brings you here tonight?" he asked, leaning closer, and his gaze suddenly became strained, although his tone remained light. "Just to celebrate Jessica's birthday," I replied, trying to keep my voice cheerful. "Have you known her long?" "Yes," he nodded. "We went to college with her. She always invites me to such events, and I just can't refuse." We laughed, and the laughter suddenly shattered the awkwardness that had surrounded me since coming to the party. "Everything has become easier." "I understand. I work with her, and she mentioned that you're an accountant." He nodded as if he already knew that. "Accounting is something special, isn't it?" I chuckled, trying to keep the conversation light. "Oh, absolutely," I played along. "All these wild parties and big bets in the world of numbers." His smile widened, and I couldn't tell if he was teasing me or if he genuinely found it funny. "Do you want to go out and get some air?" he suggested, tilting his head slightly towards the backyard. It was quiet and cool outside. The cool air was a real relief after the chaos inside. We stepped onto the empty veranda, and I suddenly felt the tension leave my body. "So what's a guy like you doing at a party like this?" I asked, trying to make my voice sound more confident than I actually felt. Peter smiled his soft, inviting smile, and his eyes shone again in the dim light. "I'm just looking to have a good time and maybe meet someone interesting." We continued to talk about everything and nothing, as if we had known each other for many years. As night fell, he pulled out his phone, smiling slightly, and said, "Can I get your number?" "I'd really like to see you again, Ma." I hesitated, not used to such attention, but something about his confidence attracted me. Finally, I took his phone and dialed my number. Peter looked at the screen and smiled again, his face shining with a warmth that couldn't help but infect. "Great. I'll call you. It's time for us to meet, just the two of us. How do you like this idea?" Emotions swirled inside me, my stomach was doing somersaults, but I just nodded, trying to look calm, even though my thoughts were racing feverishly. I watched him as he moved confidently among people, and I couldn't believe that all this was happening to me. Maybe I really turned 33, I thought, looking at his silhouette. And maybe it's not so bad. Maybe this is just the beginning of something really great. The days after Peter's call merged into one endless wait. Time seemed vague, but before I could realize it, the day of our first date arrived. I spent hours in front of the mirror going through my wardrobe and nervously thinking about what to choose. In the end, I settled on a simple blue dress, nothing special, but in my heart I hoped that it would make the right impression. At exactly 7 o'clock in the evening, the doorbell rang. Peter stood in the doorway. His car, a clean, well-groomed sedan, perfectly suited his image, neither bulky nor flashy, but elegant and reliable. He smiled at me, and that smile could knock anyone down. "You look great, Ma," he said, looking straight into my eyes. I awkwardly mumbled, "Thank you," feeling my cheeks burn. "You look good too," I added, trying to hide my embarrassment. We went to a cozy French restaurant hidden among the narrow streets of the city. It smelled of warm bread and creamy sauce, and there was an atmosphere of comfort and intimacy in the air. I was nervous, my stomach was filled with butterflies, but I tried not to give myself away. Peter, as always, was at ease and confident. We ordered dinner. He chose pasta with an exquisite sauce, and I chose a simple marinara. When the food arrived, he expertly spun the spaghetti on a fork and, smiling, asked, "So tell me something about yourself that no one knows about." I smiled back, playing with the food, but not in a hurry to taste it. "Well, I'm pretty boring," I began, a little embarrassed, "but I don't think anyone knows that I can assemble a Rubik's Cube in less than a minute." His eyes widened and he raised his eyebrows. "Really? It is very cool. Will you ever show it to me?" he asked with interest. "Of course," I replied, starting to relax a little. "Do you have any hidden talents?" I asked, feeling that a connection was gradually being established between us. He grinned, tilting his head slightly. "I'm making a disgusting breakfast burrito. The best you've ever tasted." I laughed. "I'll take your word for it, but maybe you'll prove it someday." The conversation continued, and I realized that for the first time in a long time I felt in my place, where I really wanted to be. The next few weeks flew by like a whirlwind. We saw each other all the time. Peter came to me after work, and we had lunch together in small cafes near his office. He showed me his favorite corners of the city, small hidden streets and cafes that I didn't even know about. It seemed that I saw the city for the first time, through his eyes. But things got more serious when he invited me to meet his parents, Robin and Ricarda. They lived in a cozy, light-filled house, where the walls were decorated with family photos, and the shelves were full of small souvenirs and memorable trinkets. Ricarda greeted me with such warmth that I immediately felt at home. "Oh, we've heard so much about you, darling," she said, hugging me. I felt Peter looking at me with pride. The dinner was held in a light atmosphere, and the conversation did not stop for a minute. Robin, handing me the potatoes, asked with a smile, "Peter says you're an accountant. It must be an interesting job." I laughed, "Sometimes. It's mostly just numbers, but I like the order." Ricarda, genuinely interested, asked about my family, and I gratefully told her how my father always supported me despite his busy schedule. Everything seemed so right, as if my whole life had been leading up to this moment. Peter saw me as more than just a boring accountant. And so one evening, a few months after the beginning of our whirlwind romance, we were walking along the embankment. The lights of the city reflected in the water, creating an almost fabulous picture. I was lost in my thoughts when I suddenly felt Peter stop. He turned to me and, taking my hand, said, "Ma, I don't want to wait any longer. I know it's fast, but will you marry me?" Just like that, my world has changed. Without hesitation, without the slightest doubt, I quietly said, "Yes, Peter, I will marry you." This decision came so naturally, as if it was written on the pages of my destiny. His confidence, his devotion and sincere affection for me enveloped me in warmth, as if I had found what I had been looking for all my life. The father, upon hearing the news, nodded approvingly, although he was not one of those who easily expressed their feelings. "He's a good man," he said, which meant more to me than any words. Dad's approval gave me confidence that I had made the right choice. We got married without too much pomp, but this wedding was exactly what we wanted. Modest, quiet, surrounded only by close friends and family. I was calm and happy that day. Even my wedding dress, which I could never have imagined, fit perfectly. I was smiling so wide that my cheeks hurt, but it was the pain I was enjoying. I shared photos on social media, making everyone's joy a part of my world. Life after the wedding did not slow down, on the contrary, it accelerated, as if new pages of our history were filling up faster and faster. Peter and I had barely had time to enjoy our new happiness when he offered something more. One evening, while unpacking another gift box, he suddenly said, "Hey, Ma, I thought." He stopped, looking at me with an expression that usually meant that he was ready to voice some new proposal. "How about moving in with my parents?" I froze, holding a cup of coffee in my hand. "Live with his parents?" Peter continued, his tone becoming serious. "They're not getting any younger, and I'd feel better if we were there to help. Plus it would save us some money on rent." It really made sense. But the idea of living with my husband's parents seemed like something out of a sitcom to me, and I hesitated. "Are you sure they want us to be there all the time?" I asked, feeling concern creep into my voice. Peter nodded confidently, "Absolutely. Mom has already hinted at this since we got engaged." I took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay, it's going to be okay," he said, hugging me. 3 weeks later, we drove up to his parents' house, loaded with our belongings packed in boxes. Ricardo waved at us from the porch before we even got out of the car. "Oh, Ma, I'm so glad you're both here," she exclaimed, hugging me tightly so that I almost suffocated from her embrace. Robin, Peter's father, patted him good-naturedly on the back and, turning to me, added, "Welcome home, and so are you, Ma." The house was cozy, but with furniture that looked like it had been moved straight from a museum in 1973. I tried hard not to smile, but inside I already missed our small apartment, where everything was simple and understandable. Peter, noticing my hesitation, whispered, "This will be great, you'll see," and I tried to believe him, carrying another box inside. The first few days were a time of adaptation. Ricardo seemed to follow us everywhere, constantly looking into our room with questions. "Do you need anything? Make sure you're comfortable." She was chirping with genuine concern, but her constant presence was gradually starting to strain me. It was a subtle but tangible intrusion into our personal space. One evening we sat down to dinner, Peter, Robin, and Ricardo at a large wooden table that seemed to have seen dozens of family dinners. The conversation was sluggish, we discussed the usual things, until Peter suddenly decided to drop another bomb. "You know, the house needs a major renovation," he said casually between bites of meatloaf. I froze with a spoonful of mashed potatoes halfway to my mouth. I asked, trying to comprehend what I had heard. Peter nodded as if it were something completely natural. "Yes, the roof is leaking, and the plumbing seems to have been left over from the time when the pyramids were built." Robin nodded affirmatively, as if confirming his son's words. "We thought that." Peter seemed to avoid my gaze. "We could all contribute to the expenses." I looked at Ricardo, who was suddenly lost in contemplation of her plate. I repeated, feeling a knot tighten inside me. "Well, yes," Peter seemed increasingly unsure. "My salary was reduced at work, so now I'm a little short of money." At that moment, I felt like everything inside me was turning over. "I'll see what I can do," I managed to say, although at that moment I wanted to say much more. Ricardo looked up, and tears glistened in her eyes. "Oh, Ma, that would be so helpful. You are a real angel. Ma, part of the family. I'm sure that's the part that pays for everything." These words were spinning in my head like an obsessive swarm of wasps, especially on one of those days when, completely exhausted after endless receptions from contractors and communication with the crew, I collapsed on the bed, feeling that I couldn't stand it anymore. My head was throbbing with fatigue, but even closing my eyes, I couldn't get rid of the thoughts that were buzzing in my head. Peter came into the room, sat down next to me and gently took my hand. His voice was soft, almost sincere. "Thanks, Ma, for dealing with all this." "It's okay," I lied, not taking my eyes off the ceiling. I felt empty inside, as if all the strength and emotions had left my body, leaving only a tired shell. I didn't realize how much it would all cost, not only financially, but also emotionally. Peter squeezed my hand, his voice full of confidence. "It's worth it. This is for our future." Our future. I repeated, feeling doubt creep into my words. I was no longer sure whose future we were actually building. As I lay there listening to Peter's calm breathing, who soon fell asleep, I wondered over and over again, was moving in with his parents the right decision? But there was no turning back. I was deeper than I thought, and now I had to go to the end, no matter what it took. When the renovation was finally completed, the house looked great. The walls shone with fresh paint, the kitchen seemed new, like in the pages of an interior design magazine, and despite all the financial difficulties, I couldn't help but feel a little proud of what we had achieved. We decided to have a small dinner party to celebrate this achievement, but only for the four of us, no guests, just the family. That evening started off casually. We were sitting at the table, laughing and sharing stories, until at one point the atmosphere changed dramatically. Ricarda, who had been smiling carelessly before, suddenly fell silent. There was a heavy silence. She looked at Robin, then at Peter and me, and her eyes filled with tears. "We have something important to tell you." Her voice was trembling, and I felt my stomach clench inside. Peter and I exchanged anxious glances, and I, almost afraid to find out the answer, asked, "What's going on?" Robin took a deep breath, as if he was about to tell something he had been hiding for too long. "The house is mortgaged," he began, his words sounding hollow, as if the very air in the room had become heavy. "A lot of congestion. We owe $300,000, and the bank can take the house if we don't pay off the debt within 3 months." My fork clattered onto my plate. "What do you mean?" "All this renovation that we just paid for." The words stuck in my throat. Ricarda burst into tears, as if her shame and guilt had suddenly burst out. "We were ashamed to tell you before," she stammered, crying, "but after the repairs and everything else, we just couldn't cope." I felt like the world was starting to collapse around me. All our efforts, money, nerves, and all for the sake of the house, which was about to be taken away. "And what are you suggesting now?" My voice was sharper than I intended, and Peter looked away as if he couldn't face me. "I was hoping," he began, his voice low and uncertain. "Maybe, Ma, you could talk to your father." "Are you serious? Do you want me to ask my father for $300,000? My voice rose an octave higher, and I abruptly got up from the table. "After everything he's just been through?" "Please, Ma," Peter begged, his eyes pleading with me as if he had no other choice. Ricarda, sitting across from me, was crying so loudly that I began to feel like a monster in this drama. "This is our home," she sobbed. "We spent decades in it." I was filled with rage, but the tears and pleading exhausted me to such an extent that I gave up. "I'll think about it," I muttered under my breath, feeling the trap I'd fallen into getting tighter and tighter. The next day, I dialed my father's number, my heart pounding with nerves, while I explained the situation. To my surprise, he agreed to help, but set one strict condition: "I'll give you the money, Ma, but only with a formal agreement. I want everything to be documented." When I passed this on to Peter, he was clearly unhappy. "Why does it have to be so formal? Can't he just trust us?" "That's $300,000, Peter." I tried to hold back my irritation, feeling the tension growing between us. "It's a lot of money, and he's just being careful." Peter nodded stiffly, but it was obvious that this did not suit him. "He'll get his papers," he muttered through his teeth. The documents were drawn up and the money was transferred. Ricarda and Robin thanked me endlessly, but something had changed between Peter and me. The atmosphere between us has become colder than before, as if an invisible wall has grown between us, blocking the way to what was once ours. I felt isolated in my own home, in my own life. But just when it seemed to me that it couldn't get any worse, fate struck again, and suddenly tragedy struck. "Mom, this is your Kayla." Her daughter's voice trembled like a thin string about to break. There was uncertainty in her words, but with each subsequent sound, I began to realize that something terrible was happening. "Dad. He had a heart attack. This is bad, very bad." The world began to blur before my eyes, and the air in the room suddenly became heavy as lead. I gripped the back of the chair as if it could keep me from falling into the abyss. "What? How is he?" I didn't have time, Mom." "I'm sorry." My daughter's voice trembled even more, and my legs began to give way, as if the world was collapsing under me. The phone almost fell out of my hands, but I held on to it with such force that my knuckles turned white. "No. No. This can't be true," I muttered, completely stunned, before hanging up the phone. I stood in an empty room, listening to my own breathing, while the world I knew crumbled to dust. When I turned around, Peter was standing in the doorway. His face was full of anxiety, but his gaze remained cold, almost aloof. "What happened?" he asked in a low voice, almost a whisper. "My dad," I replied, feeling like everything was breaking apart inside. "He's gone." I didn't have time to finish, as streams of tears gushed out of me. I sobbed, feeling like I was being torn to pieces. Peter came closer and hugged me. I should have felt comforted, but instead this embrace felt cold and alien. It was as if I was being hugged not by my husband, but by a stranger. His words, "I'm sorry, Ma," sounded like they came not from the heart, but from simple politeness, and this only aggravated my estrangement. All the subsequent time seemed to be an endless series of duties and formalities: funeral preparations, conversations with agencies, selection of funeral services. I was so immersed in the process that thoughts of Peter and his strange detachment sometimes disappeared, giving way to worries about my father's memory. However, one day, when I returned home earlier than usual, I realized that the silence in the house had been broken by someone's voices. As I walked up the steps to the living room, I heard Peter. He was talking to Ricarda and Robin. The tone of his voice was full of disappointment and disgust. "I can't live like this anymore," Peter said. "She's driving me crazy. This is all too much, too much." It was like I was paralyzed. I froze at the door, not daring to breathe, when Ricarda answered him. Her whisper was harsh. "Peter, you need to be patient a little more. We'll deal with these receipts from your father-in-law. Ma has them now. The sooner you get rid of them, the better for all of us." I had to stifle a scream as Peter continued, "I'll take everything, destroy them, and start over. With that rich beauty I told you about." His voice was icy, calculating, and every word cut into my heart like a knife. My body froze in horror, and a wave of rage began to rise inside me, but I knew that if I gave myself away now, everything would be lost. I had to keep my cool. I gripped the door handle, trying my best to keep from shaking. Then, pretending that I had just entered, I slammed the door loudly. Everyone instantly fell silent. Peter, Ricarda, and Robin turned around with tight smiles. "You came back early. How did everything go with the funeral planning?" Ricarda's voice sounded unexpectedly soft and caring, as if her words that had just been spoken did not exist at all. Her eyes widened in mock innocence, and I forced myself to smile, even though I was seething inside. "Thanks, everything is going according to plan," I replied calmly, although my heart was beating like crazy. I noticed how quickly they looked at each other, their faces hiding something that I hadn't even realized before. But now I knew the truth. Now I saw their true face. My father's funeral was sad. The air was filled with grief, and I accepted endless condolences with empty eyes. But when the ceremony was over and we returned to Peter's parents' house, everything went differently. There, in the silence of the living room, Peter finally showed his real face. He was sitting across from me, sipping hot coffee, but his gaze was not the way I knew him. His charming mask, the gloss and feigned benevolence he always used, suddenly disappeared, revealing something dark and predatory. "Pack your things," he said icily, without taking his eyes off me. "You need to leave. I have someone else now. Someone better." His words should have been a slap in the face, but I didn't let them. I pretended to be shocked, although inside I was already ready for this betrayal. Before I could answer, Ricarda intervened with a harsh, almost inappropriate laugh. "We've really had enough, dear," Ricarda said coldly, her words piercing like sharp blades. "We only tolerate you because of your money." I felt my heart tighten in my chest, but I held on. Their cruel words only confirmed what I had long suspected. Peter stood there, grinning. His face, which had seemed so familiar, was now distorted with contempt. "What about the house that I asked to disappear?" he continued with a cynical grin. "The house that you paid to renovate? $300,000 that you invested in it?" Ricarda couldn't stand it and burst out laughing, as if I had just told the funniest joke in the world. "Oh, this house? This is our home, and you are nobody here." Her laughter grew louder, like a person who has just won a victory. Peter's grin widened, and he added with the same icy calmness, "And those receipts that you're so proud of? We found them in your father's house, and burned them. They disappeared." I froze for a moment, letting them believe that they had actually won. But then something in the depths of me was released, and I couldn't help but laugh. It was not a laugh of joy, but of the realization of the whole pathetic nature of these people. Their smug smiles slowly faded, confusion appeared on their faces. "Why are you laughing? What's so funny?" Peter took a step forward, his voice sounding strained. I wiped a tear from my eye, still smiling. "You three. They're just pathetic," I replied with a smile, looking at each of them in turn. "Do you think you're that smart? But those receipts that you destroyed, they were just copies. The real ones are with my lawyer." The complexion of Peter, Ricarda, and Robin began to fade, as if the blood had drained from their faces. The arrogance they had been so proud of until recently began to turn into panic. Peter, usually confident in himself and his superiority, stuttered, "You can't prove anything." "I can," my voice sounded firm and confident. "And I will prove it." I paused, enjoying the moment, before adding, "Now I want all my money back. Either you return everything voluntarily, or my next call will be to the police." The men looked at each other, their faces changed. What started as a joke to them has now become a reality that they couldn't ignore. Robin, who had always seemed so brave and self-confident, suddenly became petty and pathetic. He began to beg, "Please. Let's talk about it. We can find out something." We started negotiations, but now I had all the trumps in my hands. Peter, his parents, they were cornered, and it was evident from their behavior. Every step they took, every word they said, had been thought out, but it didn't matter now. I knew they were trying to buy time, manipulate the situation, but I wasn't going to give up. "It's simple," I said calmly in one of our countless conversations in their legally configured kitchen. "The house is being transferred to my name in exchange for my money. This is a contract. No games." They resisted, but eventually gave in. It was clear that they no longer saw any other option but to agree to my terms. We all came to a common agreement: everything should be done officially and legally. I insisted that all the documents be drawn up by a lawyer and certified. The atmosphere in the law office was tense. The documents were signed, and I watched each signature without taking my eyes off it to be sure that there would be no further deception. When everything was completed, I gathered up the papers and looked at Ricarda. She looked depressed, although she was still trying to maintain the remnants of her arrogance. "I'll keep this in a safe place," I said, carefully folding the documents into a folder, defiantly showing that all their tricks would no longer work. The divorce process was short and simple. Peter didn't look the same anymore. His confidence and arrogance had evaporated, leaving only an empty shell. When the last documents were signed, I felt the weight finally lifted from my shoulders. The chapter of life with these people has closed forever. The day they left, I was standing on the porch of my house, which now belonged entirely to me. I watched as Peter, Ricarda, and Robin slowly moved their belongings into the rented van. Their movements were slow, their mood gloomy. Mixed feelings swept over me, satisfaction that everything had ended in my favor, and sadness at the shattered dreams. This is not how I imagined my marriage, but considering everything that happened, it was the best outcome. It seemed that karma caught up with them faster than I expected. Despite their predicament, they started contacting me, bombarding me with calls and messages. Probably hoping to get back into my life, or at least into my house. But I'm done with their deception. I blocked their numbers without hesitation and blacklisted them on all social networks. It was liberating to cut off the last ties to their world. One day, when I was enjoying a quiet moment with a book in my cozy living room, there was a knock on the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw Peter, a pathetic figure with a bouquet of wilted flowers. The boldness of his action made me laugh. As I opened the door, I couldn't help laughing at him. Peter, like a lost puppy, awkwardly shuffled the flowers, which, like himself, looked faded and pathetic. "Ma, I realized a lot of things," he said, his voice sounding a little desperate. "Do you remember when you said you hated me?" I interrupted him, leaning against the door frame, enjoying his discomfort. "What has changed?" I asked, genuinely surprised at how quickly he lost his confidence. His face fell, as if my words were physical blows. "I made mistakes, but I'm here to fix it." I shook my head, feeling almost sorry for him, almost. "You're not here to fix this, Peter. You're just desperately trying to get back to your comfortable life. But guess what? This life no longer exists. Not for you." His face turned darker, and he took a step back, as if I had stabbed him in the heart. "Please keep it," he tried to beg, but I interrupted him. "I want you to leave. Don't come back here. We're done for good." Peter stood on the threshold, his hope crumbling by the second. Then, without saying another word, he turned around and left. I watched his shoulders hunch in defeat. After closing the door, I returned to my book, feeling a sense of completion and relief. The silence of my house enveloped me like a comforting blanket. It was a stark contrast to the chaos that once filled this space with constant noise, tension, and deception. Now I could breathe deeply without feeling the weight of worry on my chest. I looked around the room, enjoying the calm atmosphere. The sun's rays penetrated through the windows, spreading warm light throughout the room. I realized how much I loved this house, now that it really belonged to me. The walls, which had once witnessed arguments and manipulations, now echoed with serenity and contentment. I remembered the days of turmoil and manipulation when I felt that Peter and his family had taken so much from me, both emotionally and financially. But now they are gone from my life forever. No bouquet of flowers or sweet talk could change the fact that their attempts to manipulate me were over. When I finished my tea and returned to the book, I felt a sense of triumph. I faced betrayal and grief, but I became stronger on the other hand. I took control of my life and my future. The peace I felt now was well-deserved and deeply cherished. I was really free, free from lies, free from deception, and free to live my life. A future full of opportunities and chances is spread out in front of me. I smiled again, knowing that whatever happened next, I was ready for it. A feeling of hope flared up inside me, for a new life, for new beginnings. I couldn't wait to start writing my own stories, starting with the first page of this new chapter, full of light and freedom.